Okay, this video is going to cover 3.3 for college algebra, quadratic equations and inequalities. One thing you need to know is you do need to know how to factor in order to complete this section. So if you don't know how, or you forgot, or you want to review, watch the factoring review video. That'll go through and show you the tic-tac-toe process so that you'll be able to do this chapter. All right, once you are ready, standard form of quadratics is the p of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. A is always with the x squared, b is always with the x, c is always alone. The zero product property says if you multiply two things together and get zero, at least one of them has to be zero. They can both be, but at least one has to be. This just means that if you multiply a whole bunch of things together and it equals zero, that you can solve each part by setting it equal to zero. So I'm going to show you. First, we're going to factor a quadratic in standard form when it equals zero. So all of those terms are divisible by 2. So I'm going to divide everything by 2 to get the greatest common factor out. Then I'm going to do my tic-tac-toe factoring, which is in the factoring review video if you need it. A is 1, B is 2, and A times negative C is negative 8. Now I need the factors of negative 8. So that could be negative 1 times 8, 1 times negative 8, negative 2 times 4, or 2 times negative 4. Those are all the ways to multiply and get negative 8. Now I need the pair that adds to get 2. So that's this pair, the negative 2 and 4. Order doesn't matter. For the bottom corner, I find the greatest common factor of those corners. So 1 and 4 would be 1. Then I multiply up. 1 times 1 equals 1. And I go across. 1 times negative 2 equals negative 2. 1 times 4 equals 4. Now I circle. The first column is always x. So that one is x plus 4. Same thing here, I get x minus 2, and I bring down the greatest common factor. Now I have factored that out, and I get the equation in factored form. Using the zero product property, each piece has to be able to equal 0. So I can take x plus 4 and make it equal 0. Subtract 4 from both sides, and I get x is negative 4. So that's going to be one of the solutions or one of the x-intercepts. Then I do the same thing with this part. X minus 2 equals 0. I add 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2. That is our other x-intercept or solution. Now, if there had been an x in our greatest common factor, we would also set that equal to 0. But because 2 never equals 0, there's no solution in that part. So if you feel comfortable doing this, pause the video and try the other one. If you need to see another one done out, let me know or watch. So no greatest common factor. I'm going to tic-tac-toe A, B, A times C. Factors of 9 are 1 and 9 or negative 1 times negative 9. 3 and 3 or negative 3 times negative 3. The only way to get negative 6 is negative 3 and negative 3. Greatest common factor of 1 and negative 3 is 1. Multiply up. 1 times 1 is 1. And then multiply across. 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. If I circle those, I get x minus 3 and x minus 3. Now those are the same. So if I do x minus 3 equals 0 and add 3 to both sides, I'm going to get 3 for both of them. This just means there's only one x-intercept. That's fine. All right, so when it says solve and sets it equal to 0, then that's one way to do it. Another way is if there's only one x and there isn't the x squared and the x, there's just the one of them, you can just solve using algebra. You don't have to factor. So for this one, I would divide by 2, and I get x squared equals negative 5. And then to undo a squared, we take the square root. So square root of both sides means x equals the square root of negative 5. And from 3, 1, that negative gives us an I. And when you take the square root, there's always a positive and a negative. So x is plus or minus I root 5. We can do the same thing here because there's only one x. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I get x minus 1 squared equals 7. Then I take the square root of both sides, just like we did before. So we would get x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. I'm going to add 1 to get the x alone. So x equals 1 plus or minus root 7. That's one way to write that. You could write them separate. 1 plus root 7, 1 minus root 7, because you always have a positive and a negative when you take the square root. That's what happened here. But either of these is the same thing and an appropriate answer. That's exact form. If you put it in the calculator and you type 1 plus square root 7, you'd get 3.65. And if you did 1 minus square root 7, you'd get negative 1.65. So depending on what's asked, if it says exact, you have to give one of the ones in the boxes. If it doesn't, the decimal is fine. You can also use completing the square from section 3.2 to solve. So first we'd have to get it into vertex form. So step 1 was to divide by a, which in this case is 0. So, or I mean 1, so we don't have to do anything. Then we move c over. Then we add b plus 2 squared to both sides. So negative 4 over 2 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared is 4. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. Then we rewrite for x plus b over 2 squared, which b over 2 was negative 2, we found right here. So we're going to change this side to x minus 2 squared. Then we can solve. Now we can solve for x because it equals a number. So we take the square root of both sides. So we get plus or minus root 2. Add 2 to both sides. We get 2 plus or minus root 2. So if we're trying to do the vertex, we'd put it back into vertex form. If we're trying to solve, we just, once we get to this point where we equal a number and we only have one x, we can do completing the square. So you go ahead and try the other one, pause the video, and then check in. So here we have to divide everything by a. So I'm going to divide everything by 8. I get x squared plus 1/4 x equals 3 over 8. The c is already over there, so we don't have to do that part. But we need to add b over 2 squared to both sides. So 1/4 divided by 2 is 1/8. And 1/8 squared is 1/64. So I'm going to add that to both sides. X squared plus 1/4 x plus 1/64. And if I add these together, we'd have to multiply these by 8, so I'd get 24 over 64, which becomes 25 over 64 when I add 1. Rewrite this side to x plus b over 2 squared. Then to solve, I would take the square root of both sides. So the square root of 25 is 5, square root of 64 is 8, and we have plus or minus. So I would subtract this from both sides. So one way to do that is to write them out. I can do x plus 1/8 equals 5/8. And when I subtract 1/8 from both sides, I get 4/8, which is the same as 1/2. And then I could do x plus 1/8 equals negative 5/8. And when I subtract 1/8 from both sides, I get negative 6/8, which is negative 3/4. Now, the reason I did this one out is because I can get an answer from the fractions, whereas the square root would have rounded. I could have also written it like this. And then you could put it in the calculator, get a decimal. That would be fine. You can go further on these without reducing, which is why you would if you didn't have a square root. So there are solutions. The discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. If you do that and you get an answer that's greater than 0, that means when you solve it, you're going to get 2 real solutions. If it equals 0, when you solve it, you're going to get 1 real solution. And if it's less than 0, you're going to get 2 complex solutions, meaning you'll get I when you solve it. So the purpose of doing the discriminant is to figure out what you should expect when you do the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is what you do to get your solutions or your x-intercepts when you can't factor. So this will always work. Factoring will only sometimes work, so it's up to you how you want to do it. But in order to do the quadratic formula, your first step is to get your equation to equal 0. So in order to do that here, I would need to get rid of the parentheses. Then I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. And I'm going to add 2. So now I have x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. If I tried to factor that, it wouldn't work. So I'm going to do the quadratic formula using this as our a, b, and c. So negative b, the opposite of b would be 4, plus or minus, big square root. Then I do b squared minus 4ac, and again, I'm just plugging in these for a, b, and c. And that's all divided by 2a. So if I were to do this right here, I would get 16 minus 8. And if I do this, I get 2. 16 minus 8 is 8. And now I'm going to simplify that. So 8 is 4 times 2. The square root of 4 is 2, leaving the other 2 inside. And then I reduce. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. Those would be my 2 real answers, 2 plus or minus root 2. You also can type it right into the calculator. 4 plus square root of, parentheses, negative 4 squared minus 4ac, and then divide by 2. That gives me, I'm just going to write it, 3.41. And then if I did again, 4 minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4ac divided by 2, I would get 0.59. And if I just type those, 2 plus square root 2 and 2 minus square root 2, I get the same thing. So you can do it by hand, you can do it on the calculator, that's up to you. But now that you have that, pause the video and try solving the other one. All right, this one already equals 0. So we have a, b, and c. Opposite of b, plus or minus, b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. If I did it out, 1 squared is 1, and then 4 times 2 is 8, times 4 is 64. So we're saying 1 minus 64? No, 32. That would help. 8 times 4 is 32. So 1 minus 32, and then 2 times 2 is 4. 1 minus 32 is negative 31. And that negative just makes it an I. We cannot reduce 31, so we'd stop there. If you put that in the calculator, you would still get I because we changed the setting the other day. But it would look like this. So you'd get 0.25 plus 1.39i You might be able to turn it into a fraction, but because that's a crazy square root, you'd still end up with a decimal. So either of those is fine. Okay, inequalities. Same thing. If you're solving for inequalities, you're saying, when on this graph, is it less than 0? So we're looking for these parts. If you have the graph, we just find the point. So when x is -3 and when x is 1 are our intercepts. To be less than 0, we'd write the domain of this part. So -infinity to -3. And then the domain of this part is 1 to infinity. That's one way to do it if you have the graph. Find your x-intercepts and fill in the point. If you don't have the graph, then we need to do our factoring or our quadratic formula. So if you choose to factor, we'd get a times c. Then we have to find all our factors of -12. And this is the pair that gives us 1. Oh, okay. That was this one here. This is a separate, this equation does not match that graph, okay? So now greatest common factor of 1 and 4, multiply up, multiply across. We would get x minus 4 and x plus 3 is less than 0. So we would solve these just like normal. X minus 4 equals 0. We would add 4 to both sides. And then we would do x plus 3 equals 0 and subtract 3 from both sides. Those would be the x-intercepts. Now we're going to test a point to see. So something between the -3 and 4. So I'm going to test 0 and I'm going to plug it in. 0 squared minus 0 equals -12 or minus 12. And is -12 less than 0? Yes. So just like we did with the absolute value, we're going to say from -3 to 4 is less than 0. If we had gotten no, we would write the 2 just like before. So try this one. You can graph it, you can quadratic formula, you can factor, but see if you can do it and then check it out. So first we need to make it equal 0. So I'm going to move everything over to the left. Then I can tic-tac-toe. A times C. So it's not that. -3 and 8. So I found one that equals 5, so I'm just going to stop. You can keep going. Greatest common factor of 2 and 8 is 2. 2 times 1 equals 2. 1 times -3 equals -3. 2 times 4 equals 8. So we have x plus 4 and 2x minus 3 is greater than or equal to 0. We're going to solve each of these as if it equals 0. So we get -4 for one number. And then I add 3. Because there's a number in front of the x, I need to divide by 2. So I get 3 over 2 or 1.5. I need to test a point in between. So one's positive, one's negative. I can test 0. So I'm going to take my original equation. The original equation. And plug in 0. So 2x squared greater than or equal to -5x plus 12. So if I put 0 in for x, I would end up with 0 is greater than or equal to 12, which is not true. So I write the 2 brackets. I say -infinity to -4 with a bracket because we have the equal sign, and then 3/2 to infinity. So this part's just like the absolute value. Here are 4 more, or 2 more of those. Notice these are the same equation, so we would only have to do one of them in order to figure it out. So we're going to pretend it equals 0. If I tic-tac-toe, it won't work. So I'm going to do negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And I believe this is the same problem we already did back with completing the square. So we already have that the answers are 2 plus or minus root 2. If you do it all out, you can find that. Now, in order to test this, I actually need a decimal to plug it in to make my life easier. So if I do these, I would get 3.41 and 0.59 if I plugged that in the calculator. Now I need a point between those to plug in. So let's do 1. So 1 squared minus 4 times 1 plus 2 is less than or equal to 0. 1 squared is 1. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. 1 minus 4 is negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 is less than 0. So it's a yes for the less than over here. So we would write 2 minus root 2 to 2 plus root 2. And we would do brackets because of the equal sign. Then this is the same equation. We're just saying greater than 0. So we would know the answer is no. And then we'd write this one as the 2 brackets. And when you subtract something, that's less than adding it. That's why I put that one first. Now, you could use the 2 plus square root, or you could use these numbers. Either is fine. All right, the last part of this section is solving for a letter. When it says solve for D, it just means rewrite it so it's D equals. So to get the 4 on the other side, we would multiply both sides by 4. To get the D alone, we would divide both sides by pi. And to undo the squared, we would take the square root. The biggest thing to remember is you need a plus or minus. If you end up taking the square root, put a plus or a minus in front. For this one, we're solving for t. So notice these both have t's. I want to factor 1 out. No, I don't, because I'll still have a t in there. So we have a squared, which means we want to do the quadratic formula. So we're going to subtract k from both sides. So it equals 0. And then we're just going to treat r as a, negative s as b, and negative k as c. So opposite of b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then just simplify wherever we can. So negative s squared is just s squared. And then negative 4r negative k is really plus 4rk all over 2r. And that's as simplified as you can get it. So it's just about plugging things in and solving. That is the rest of 3.3. Let me know if you have any questions.